This is Danny Jilkin, and you're listening to the Level Flight Podcast.
Maroon center, goal! Connor Hellebuck! Golden opportunity, Kyle Connor shoots, and he scores! Kyle Connor! Triple overtime series winner! Can you believe it? Shankly on to Morrissey, scores! Josh Morrissey! In overtime, and the Jets win it 5-4.
And welcome into episode 42 of the Level Flight Podcast. My name is Connor. I'm joined by Brian and Elliott today. And once again, for the third week in a row, we are joined by a very special guest. We have Scott Wheeler of The Athletic here with us. Scott, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm just finishing it right before I hopped on here, just finishing up my sort of preseason draft ranking now that the Holinka Gretzky Cup is all wrapped up. So excited to have that out. It'll probably be out sometime next week. And that's really all I'm working on these days. And all I'm focused on right now is just sort of prep for a new year, prep for 2024.
Yeah, and for people who, may not have seen your writing yet, obviously, in my opinion, they're missing out big time. But what do you do for The Athletic? What kind of stuff do you cover, just as an introduction?
Yeah, I cover prospects in the NHL draft. That's it. I covered the Leafs for a few seasons at The Athletic, but for the better part of the last 5 years, I've covered prospects in the NHL draft exclusively. So the World Juniors, U18 Worlds, the Holinka Gretzky Cup, the World Junior Summer Showcase, selection camps, the Memorial Cup, the Frozen Four. Everything that happens before these kids reach the NHL is sort of my responsibility at The Athletic. So that's both storytelling and telling stories about these kids, and a sort of travel budget to go out and tell stories about these kids. And then it's also just a lot of time spent in rinks, watching them play, and sort of building my list and going about it that way. So that's the job. I've been at The Athletic for coming up on 8 years here, which is crazy. And that's been the job for most of it.
Yeah, and we're definitely going to get into the storytelling aspect later. We've got a few questions about Danny Jilkin. You had a great piece about a year ago on him. We'll get into that. But first off, I want to start, obviously, the Winnipeg Jets, their prospect pool, there's only really one way to look at it. There's the 4 forwards at the top, and then the rest, however you want to rank them. It seems like we had Murat Atesh of The Athletic on last week, and he has Chaz Lucius number 1. You asked most of Jets Twitter, they have Brad Lambert number 1. I believe you had Colby Barlow number 1. Like, it seems like everyone has a different ranking of these 4 forwards. Do you see it as that close between Barlow, McGroarty, Lucius, and Lambert?
Yeah, it's really close. They all fit into kind of that same tier. I don't think any of them are more likely to be stars in terms of what their outcome is, but I think in each of them you've got different combinations of tools that should make them all top 9 players in their own right. The risk and the reward is certainly highest probably with a player like Brad Lambert, who I think there's a ceiling for him as a star, as a potential star. And I think there's also a ceiling where Brad Lambert is a quadruple A guy who can never quite sort of get out of the AHL and sort of find a role in an NHL lineup. And he's got work to do in terms of getting stronger, filling out his frame. We know the skating and the skill and the sort of natural athleticism is obviously there in spades. But decision-making and reads and all of that has been a bit of an issue for Brad. The other 3 feel a little bit more projectable, a little safer in terms of Colby Barlow is going to be an NHL player. Like, I have no doubt about that. Rutger McGroarty is going to be an NHL player. If not for the injury troubles, I probably would have said the same about Chaz. Chaz has obviously been battling health for the better part of 4 seasons now. It's a concern. Like, you can't sort of sugarcoat it. I don't think anybody sort of feels otherwise. And not a concern that he's just going to constantly be injured, but a concern over just the lost time and playing catch up and what that looks like for him moving forward in terms of just maybe being a little bit further behind the 8 ball relative to where you would have hoped he would have been at this stage in his development just because of the lost time. And then he finally goes to Portland and gets going, and what happens? Another injury, right? So, I like all of those players. I was coincidentally higher on my list on all 4 of those players relative to where they were picked. Certainly in Chaz and in Brad's case, I was much higher. I thought that Chaz was a borderline top 10 guy in his draft class, even with the injury and the lost time that he'd had, and he's dealt with foot and hip and knee, and like it's been shoulder. Yeah. So I like each of those kids for different reasons, but certainly in Colby and in Rutgers' case, like those guys feel already like NHL players. Like you just run into them. They're both super physically mature. They're both extremely well-spoken, especially in Rutgers' case. Rutgers is, I think, a budding star that way, just in terms of his energy and the way he carries himself, the way he talks. I could see him being a captain in the NHL, that kind of a thing. So Rutger and Colby, like their ceilings feel to me like scoring third line wingers, and I think their floors feel to me like scoring third line wingers, and I think they've got a legit chance to be top 6 guys. I think Chaz and Brad also have that chance, but there does come with them a little bit more sort of not questions, but a little bit more uncertainty in terms of what that's going to look like. And they also feel to me both like players who maybe don't fit if they can't be top 6 guys. They maybe don't fit that sort of bottom 6 role quite like a Colby Barlow or a Rutger McGroarty could. So there's just a little bit more, as I said, a little bit more uncertainty with Chaz and Brad.
And I think you said it really well there, where it's as if guys like McGroarty and Barlow, they're projected to be that future sort of captain style of player. The Jets recently have seemingly been picking a lot of character guys who have that upside, especially when you see what they were doing at development camp. And, you know, Barlow and especially McGroarty would stick around for just hours after and, you know, talking to kids and signing everything. Do you think it's harder to find, because I think that they've done a great job of balancing the two, but do you think it's harder to find those guys that have that future captain capability but still have that high end skill?
Yeah, I mean, in a dream world, that's what your team is full of, right? You want a team full of Colby Barlow and Rutger McGroarty's. If you had 10 of your 12 players were like that, you'd be an excellent NHL team. They can score, they're physical, they get after it on the forecheck, they're heavy, they're sort of physically mature in terms of their builds. They're both very stocky kids. They play off of their line mates well. They do a lot of what coaches are looking for out of a player, both on and off the ice. So it seems to me like it's something that they've coveted, even in Cole Perfetti, obviously no longer a prospect, but Cole was in his draft class probably the kid who impressed me the most in terms of the way that he spoke and carried himself and handled himself. I came out of doing a feature on Cole that year thinking that's an extremely impressive kid. He almost didn't even talk like he was a hockey player. He seemed almost like an intellectual. So it's not just Colby and Rutger that have checked that box. I think Danny Zhilkin's an impressive kid. Certainly Cole Perfetti's an impressive kid. Thomas Milic, who they took this year, is a very smart kid. You can just tell. So it's something that they've identified as sort of important for this next chapter for them as they kind of turn the page a little bit. And I don't blame them. And then on top of that, they're not just going after that. I think where you run into trouble is if that's the focus, right? The focus is on the intangibles, and they haven't made that the focus. All those kids can play, and all those kids were drafted right about where you'd expect them to be drafted. So it's not as if they're reaching on some of these guys. I would argue that happened in Ottawa with Tyler Boucher when they took him 10th overall. Tyler was a kid who was really impressive off the ice. Like Rutger and Colby was a very physically mature kid. You ran into him at the rink and you're like, oh, damn, that kid's jacked. And then he also spoke really well. But they drafted him a little bit too high, right? And I don't think they've done that with Colby and Rutger. I believe Rutger was 14 and Colby was 18. So those are good ranges for both of those players.
So you mentioned that Brad Lambert's kind of your personal pick out of the 4. Would you stick with that if you had to pick a leader out of those 4 quote unquote top tier prospects?
No, I wouldn't say at this stage he's sort of my front of that group guy. In fact, he might be 3rd or 4th at this point. He wasn't. I just did my top 50 drafted prospects ranking, and those other 3 guys were in there, and Brad sort of just missed the cut for the top 50. So that sort of speaks to where I'm at on him. The skill is there. I was in Kamloops for the Memorial Cup. I watched him play live there. I've obviously seen him internationally live a bunch. I've obviously watched a ton of tape on him. I've gotten to know him. I've done a couple of stories on him, that kind of a thing. As I mentioned, the skating and skill is legit. It's the highest end of those four players in terms of just natural talent. He's a great athlete off the ice, even though he's a very skinny kid off the ice. He actually has a lot of work to do in the gym to fill out his frame, but a very natural athlete. And part of the reason he's a skinny kid is because he struggles to keep on weight. Just his metabolism, I think, he's got that sort of athlete's metabolism where he eats 4,000 calories a day and it doesn't really matter. It doesn't help him actually gain weight. He's worked very hard with Gary Roberts the last 2 summers. Actually here where I'm from in Aurora. And I know that's been a big focus of him, just eating better, sort of adding that muscle so that the athleticism can then really shine through. But it's that with me, the question with Brad has more to do with, is he a center or is he a winger? And then that sort of boom or bust element of he's not going to be a bottom 6 guy. Like that's just right. So he either needs to win a job in the top 6 and be a star point producing impact player that way, or he may struggle to carve out a niche in the NHL. And then on top of that, I think his decision-making frustrates coaches. There's a lot of skating into trouble. There's a lot of shooting into shin pads. He's not the smartest player out there. So you see the flashes of skill, and certainly with Seattle, it was a lot of fun to watch him. I didn't think he played his best in the Memorial Cup, but before that, him and Dylan Genther were kind of their dynamic duo there and had an excellent playoff run. I thought he really shined. He's worked hard on the defensive game. I don't think that's going to make or break him. I think it's the reads and the decision-making that he needs to figure out.
Sort of outside of that core group now, and we've talked about him already a bunch, but you released an article just over a year ago on Danny Zhilkin. We had Danny on the podcast a couple weeks ago. He was awesome. And what we chatted about was something that you covered on your piece on him, which is his hockey story. What do you remember writing sort of about writing that piece, and what stood out to you from Zhilkin the person?
Yeah, just a really, really interesting story and a bit of a growing trend. There are increasingly kids who are coming over here from Russia. It used to be that they came over and some played their junior hockey in the CHL and then got drafted, but even that was a pretty rare thing. Almost all of them played in the MHL and then the VHL and then the KHL and got drafted through that process. Increasingly, I think kids are trying to get over here early and actually play some of their minor hockey here. So he came over at a very young age, moved here basically on his own with his mother, taught himself the language, went to a sort of international school, quote unquote, to specifically focus on learning English, played his minor hockey here, and now represents Canada, not Russia. And that's been a choice that he's sort of made. He considers Canada home. And I mean, you guys saw his English is impeccable at this point, and it's just I think an interesting story. Adar Sanayev, who was drafted in this preceding draft, followed a similar path, came over here, played his minor hockey in the United States, then went sort of the prep school route instead of the OHL route like Danny did, and was just selected. He's another Russian kid, Russian father, made that choice to come over here earlier. And it's a big move as a kid to sort of leave home. So he's an impressive kid. He's also, his game is about skating and two-way play. And I think he's always been a better player than his numbers have suggested, a more impactful player than his numbers have suggested, just because of his commitment defensively, the fact that he's a natural center, the detail to his game, the skating to his game. He's an excellent, excellent skater. So I'm interested to see what he becomes. I think he's the kind of guy who's just going to play his way through the AHL, and you might see him at 23, 24 years old, sort of break into the NHL and become an everyday NHLer. If that's his outcome, I think that's a positive outcome out of a third round pick. So I think he's got an opportunity to do that. If not become an everyday NHLer, then at least become sort of good organizational depth, a 13th or 14th forward that if you run into injuries, you can call him up and you can plug him in at center or plug him in on the wing and he can skate and keep up in the NHL. And he kind of reminds me a little bit of sort of a lesser Joe Veleno. Joe sort of was obviously a star prospect and an exceptional status player, so a different path. But Danny was a top prospect in minor hockey, and him and Joe both played 3 years. They're both great athletes and skaters. They're both sort of two-way centers. And Joe, it took him some time. He's now established himself as kind of a third-line center in the NHL with the Detroit Red Wings. But I think that's what you'd hope for, is that kind of a player out of Danny Zhilkin if he figures it out and puts it all together over the next couple of years here.
And if I'm not mistaken, I remember reading your pre-draft rankings in 2022. You had Zilkin, I believe, in like the mid 50s. Obviously, the Jets get him in the third round at 77. Has your like kind of outlook on him changed? Would you still like think of him as kind of a mid second round pick kind of thing? Or do you more see him in the third round?
Yeah, I think once you get into that sort of 50 to 80 range, I said this about Hunter Brustevich, a kid who was sort of in my 40s and 50s this year, who the Canucks just drafted in the 80s, or maybe in the late 70s. I had that same question from Canucks fans, like, did we get a steal here? And really, the truth is that 20 picks at that range in the draft is kind of just the expected range. Like if I have a kid who's 50th and he goes 70th, that's not necessarily some giant steal. So I think he was always kind of a second or third round guy. I think he still is sort of viewed as more of a late second, early third round guy. That's sort of how I'd sort of quantify him. I would call him a B prospect. Maybe if all goes well, he'll become more of a B plus guy. That's sort of the tier. He's a cut below the big four that we talked about, obviously, and he's even probably a cut below an Elias Salomonsson, for example, who I would definitely say is more of a B plus guy than a B guy. So he'd fit comfortably into that sort of 8 to 10 range in most prospect pools around the league, I think.
Well, and you mentioned a name that I was actually going to ask you about, which is Elias Salomonsson. He's starting to pick up some steam among Jets fans. What can you say about his first year since being drafted and sort of how much he has either raised his stock or grown as a player?
Definitely raised his stock. I spoke with the Skellefteå staff for a different story that I was doing about, I want to say 3-4 months ago in the spring. I was doing a story on Axel Sandin Pellikka, who was obviously drafted out of that program. And just at the end of the conversation with both the GM and the coach there, I said, hey, tell me, what were your impressions of Elias this year? Just because I was curious. And they both said, one of them said, and I'll never remember the quote, he said, I've never seen an average player go from average to great in one season. I've seen good players go from average to great in one season, but I'm not sure I've ever seen an average one go from average to great. And he said that's what Elias did last year. They were he kind of joked with me that they were kind of low on him. They weren't sure of his NHL prospects. They thought he was a decent sort of prospect for their SHL team and a worthwhile sort of second or third round pick, which is where the Jets took him, but they weren't super excited about him. And then he went in and unfortunately he got injured and it cost him playing at last year's World Juniors and sort of cost him this steep incline that he was on. But he went in and he was playing huge minutes. And they told me he was in the first half of last season before he got injured. They felt he was one of their 1 or 2 best defensemen on the SHL team, which for an 18, 19-year-old kid is a huge deal. So kind of reminds me of what happened with Wallander, the Red Wings prospect, who sort of was a second-round pick of the Red Wings and then just sort of exploded and was named Junior Player of the Year in the SHL in his post-draft season. Elias was never going to win Junior Player of the Year because Leo Carlsson had that sewn up pretty quickly last season. But he was one of the better stories in the SHL last year, one of the better young players in the SHL last year. He's going to be a huge part of Sweden's top 4 at this upcoming World Juniors on home ice in Gothenburg. So this is going to be another year this year where he goes back there. He plays in the SHL. He's going to be a top 4 defenseman for his SHL team. And then at Christmas time, we're going to really get to know him in terms of the average fan is going to really get to know him because he's going to be a big part of Team Sweden. And they have a very good team, especially on defense. So, reason to be excited about what he did in that front half before he got injured last year.
So you'd already mentioned Thomas Milic, but I just wanted to touch on the 2 Jets goaltender prospects that they have, Milic and Dominic DiVincentis. Where are you at in terms of both of them? Like, where are they compared in your mind?
Well, I would have Dom. I would have DiVincentis higher in terms of pool ranking. I like Dom. Dom had an excellent season last year. Virtually no other goalie in the OHL had a good season last year. The way that the OHL played last year and how high scoring it was last season. I think a lot of that has to do with the pandemic and just sort of everybody being a little bit behind, and the OHL wasn't great hockey for the most part last year. Certainly lesser hockey than the WHL, who managed to get in their bubble season during the pandemic. Dom's a good goalie. Like Dom's going to likely be the starter for Canada at this year's World Juniors. Another player you can expect to see in sort of around Christmas time. I think it'll probably be him or Sabres prospect Scott Ratzlaff, who wins the net. Canada likes to only take 2 goalies rather than 3 so that their 2 goalies can really focus on it. I don't know whether they'll bring 3 because it's in Europe and it would be harder to get one over there if they ran into an injury. So that they may bring 3 this year, but I expect that he's going to be one of the 2 at minimum. He was tremendous last season. He's athletic. He moves well, not the biggest guy, but sort of really sound positional goalie who can still move. He doesn't swim a lot in his net. He plays a sort of a compact style. And he feels to me another like sort of B+ prospect. He's not one of the 5 or 10 best goalie prospects in the sport at the moment, but he'd be right there in that sort of next tier. He's a solid goalie prospect. Milic, at this point, you can't ignore the track record. I think they were smart to take him as an overager. Another, again, small, even much smaller than DiVincentis, sort of 5'11", 6 foot. But we've seen him on the world stage at the World Juniors. He's been excellent in the WHL each of the last 2 seasons, really each of the last 3 seasons, if you include that 20-game bubble season. He's you can't fault them for taking him at this point. He's one of those goalies who just battles. Despite being small, I wouldn't call him this sort of freak athlete. And typically those 5'11", 6 foot goalies are just super athletic, right? And that's not really Milic. He just battles. He battles for every puck in the net. He will get turned around sometimes. He will swim at times. But he will square up on shots. He does a good job controlling his rebounds, and then he just fights for everything in the net and makes saves. And ultimately, that's what it's all about. So I like both of them. I would call Dom sort of a B+ guy, and Milic sort of a B guy, if you will.
And just for kind of prospects in general, you talked about how Salomonson's going to go to the World Juniors this year. DiVincentis might start for Canada. Mm-hmm. When the Jets selected Milic, a lot of fans already knew the name because he obviously played for Canada last year at the World Juniors. How much does like playing good for that 2-week stretch for the World Juniors do for prospects? Like, I feel like Milic, if he had a bad tournament, probably wouldn't have even got selected because that tournament just raised his stock so much to the point where the Jets, like you said, had to take him in the 5th round. You can't fault them for taking him. Just how much does the World Juniors do for prospects stock?
It's not nothing. I think we've seen it, not just the World Juniors, but international events in general can inflate a prospect stock, probably a little bit too much, I would argue at times. I think in Vasily Podkolzin's case, for example, Vasily Podkolzin, I think, was drafted too high. And I said this throughout his draft year when I was lower on him. I think he was drafted too high because he was absolutely tremendous at the Hlinka Gretzky Cup and looked like a true star there and dominated and scored end-to-end goals and just looked like a stud. I think the same could be said for Philip Broberg when Edmonton took Philip Broberg as high as he could. Philip Broberg was excellent internationally. This year, we saw what happened with Tom Willander, who was drafted again by Vancouver at the very top of the draft after really impressing everybody who watched him at U18 Worlds in Switzerland. So it happens. It can be a big deal. I think teams get a little bit carried away at times. Every team has multiple scouts at these events. Instead of one guy sort of pounding the table for them after the event, sometimes you have 2 or 3 guys pounding the table for them. It just becomes a bit of a thing, I would argue. Certainly the World Juniors is no different and maybe it should be. I mean, Thomas Milic was big on a big stage in huge moments. Thomas Milic doesn't make a diving save against Slovakia. Canada's out in the quarterfinals, and instead he makes that save. Bedard scores one of the all-time great goals in the history of the World Juniors. Canada beats Slovakia, and Canada later wins the gold medal, right? So Milic was huge for Canada in that tournament, especially in that quarterfinal against Slovakia, and where him and Bedard really saved that team. And we'd be talking about that team as a huge disappointment had they lost to Slovakia in the quarters. So it can matter. It shows that he's got pedigree, that he's sort of hasn't backed down from the moment. That's true in the WHL as well. Obviously, he was the WHL playoff MVP this year, won a WHL championship. So he's played now across multiple levels in big games. And I do think teams care about that.
Yeah. And, just looking at the Jets prospect pool as a whole, going into this next year of development for all these young players, who are you most intrigued to watch?
I hate to say it, but probably the one that people are most familiar with at this point, which is maybe Ville Heinola. Like it's crunch time for Ville. It's either you make it and you become an everyday guy and you become a top six as the Jets sort of turn the page, or the clock suddenly starts really ticking because teams start to feel much different about 22, 23, 24-year-olds than they do about 19 and 20-year-olds. And maybe that's unfair, especially to defensemen who can take a little bit longer. But I was high on Ville in his draft year, another kid who was picked higher or picked lower than where I had him ranked. And I was a big believer that he was going to be kind of a second pairing PP2 guy who could sort of really drive offense at 5-on-5 and then still contribute on the power play and become sort of an 18 to 20 minute guy. Not a true sort of top 3 guy, but maybe a solid number 4 on an NHL team. And now I think this season we all know is kind of like it is what it is. It's make or break, I think, for him a little bit. So he's probably the one. He doesn't feel as much like a prospect maybe anymore, but he's probably the one who I'll be watching most closely just because suddenly your value starts to dwindle if you get up there in age and you still haven't broken through.
Yeah. Well, unless Brian or Elliot, if you guys have any more questions, I think no, good to go. Yeah, this was a pleasure. Thank you so much. We love talking about prospects, the next wave of the Jets in general. I know you plugged yourself at the start, but go ahead again, tell people where you are, what you're working on, all that.
Yeah, draft ranking will be out soon at The Athletic, and then it's right into the season and really full force covering the 2024 NHL draft. I'll be in Gothenburg, Sweden for the World Juniors, so looking forward to that. I'll be in Buffalo for the Buffalo Prospect Tournament, which is about a month away now, all of those various prospect tournaments, Buffalo, Traverse City, etc. So looking forward to getting back into the rink and watching some of these drafted kids as well. And then I can't wait for Boxing Day. That's my Super Bowl, if you will, is the World Juniors. So really looking forward. I've traveled all over Europe to cover hockey, and Sweden's kind of the last of the big hockey playing countries I haven't been to. And I've heard awesome things about Gothenburg, so looking forward to that. That's sort of around the corner.
Well, we'll have to check in with you a little bit after we see potentially a bunch of Jets on the world stage there to see what you saw from them and sort of set the stage for the back half of their seasons wherever they head back to.
Cool. Looking forward to it.
Scott Wheeler of The Athletic. Thank you so much for coming on. This was a blast. Yeah, we'll get out of here. That was episode 42 of the Level Flight Podcast. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we will see you next week.
Today's episode of the Level Flight Podcast is brought to you by DraftKings. New customers download the DraftKings Sportsbook app and use code THPN. Just bet $5 to score $150 in bonus bets instantly. That's code THPN only at DraftKings Sportsbook. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In Massachusetts, call 800-327-5050 or gamblinghelplinema.org. In New York, call 877-HOPE-NY or HOPE-NY via text. In Kansas, call 1-800-522-4700 on behalf of Boot Hill Casino and Resort. In West Virginia, gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit www.1800gambler.net. All games regulated by the West Virginia Lottery. Please play responsibly. In partnership with the Hollywood Casino at Charlestown Races. In Connecticut, help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org. 21 plus in most eligible states, but age varies by jurisdiction. See DraftKings.com/sportsbook for details and state-specific responsible gambling resources. Bonus bets expire 7 days after issuance. 1 boost per eligible game. Opt-in required. Max bet $50. 10 plus legal requirement for 100% boost. Eligibility, wagering, and deposit restrictions apply. Terms at sportsbook.draftkings.com/baseball terms. Even if you're not going on vacation, summer's all about a vacation state of mind. Whether I want to listen to Noah Khan on repeat, or I just want to retreat inside my own head for a bit, I love creating my own summer soundtrack by popping in my Raycon wireless earbuds. There's so much going on all summer. Sometimes you just need some upbeat music to pump you up before you see people, or stay calm with some guided meditation. I'll listen to, something that works best on the dock, or maybe I'm going for a run at the lake. I don't know. I have something that I can listen to for whatever mood, and that's why I use my Raycons. Let me tell you right now, Raycons are the best way to listen. Use earbud tap functions to toggle between 3 customizable sound profiles, noise isolation, and awareness mode. Raycons have a 32-hour battery life, including 8 hours of playtime, so you can listen to what you want, when you want, for a really long time. They come with custom gel tips for the most comfortable in-ear fit. They start at half the price of other premium audio brands, but they sound just as good. And Raycons come with a 30-day happiness guarantee, so you really can't lose. Create your own soundtrack with Raycon. Right now, Level Flight podcast listeners can get 15% off their Raycon order at buyraycon.com/THPN. That's buyraycon.com/THPN to save 15% on Raycons. buyraycon.com/THPN.
Welcome back into episode 42 of the Level Flight Podcast. Thank you once again to DraftKings and Raycon for sponsoring this video. We just wrapped up our conversation with Scott Wheeler of The Athletic, prospect guru, whatever you want to call him. He's great with prospects. That was a great conversation. And yeah, for the next couple of weeks on the agenda, we have Blake Wheeler's best moments sitting in the vault, waiting to be posted. That you might see that in the next couple of weeks. And then yeah, we're gonna try and keep rolling with the guests. We've had Murat, we've had Danny Zhilkin, we've had Scott Wheeler. And we really enjoy the interview process, having people on. So what were your guys' takeaways from that interview, Elliot?
I just thought it was really cool that, yes, he knows the Jets prospect names, but he was just throwing out other players' names that he could compare to, or just other players that were in similar molds or spaces that some of these Jets prospects were. And like obviously I was aware of a lot of the names. I think there was only one that I didn't, but I just thought it was pretty impressive that without even anything in front of him, he just knew that information.
Yeah, and I mean that's kind of where I was at too, where it was just nice to have the comparables and have that experience that he's had watching some of the guys as well, and being able to just drop the information that he's picked up over the years and give either the answer to the question or allowing us to sort of delve a little bit deeper into it and jump in with some follow-ups.
Yeah, that was great. And you provided some incredible insight on, the top 4 forwards, Elias Salomonsson. I said before we hopped on here that everyone on Jets Twitter was talking about how Elias Salomonsson had a great year last year. Admittedly, I didn't watch any games. Like, I wasn't watching the Sweden team, I'm not going to lie. So asking a guy like Scott Wheeler, who, puts in the work, grinds his ass off to know that information specifically, that's pretty cool. So yeah, episode 42 of the Low Flight Podcast. That was that. Wrapped just like that. Thank you once again to our sponsors for sponsoring this video. And yeah, Blake Wheeler's best moments coming soon.
All right. See you next week, folks.
See you next week.